Wambui Ippolito is a horticulturist and landscape designer and a graduate of the New York Botanical Gardens School of Professional Horticulture. Her design ethos is influenced by her time as a child in East Africa's Rift Valley. In addition to her design work, Wambui develops programming for museums, public gardens, and parks, exploring the broader context of horticulture, focusing on the intersections between migration, design, history, culture, and science. She lectures in both the US and internationally. Wambui is also the founder of the BIPOC Hort Group, a multicultural professional organization with membership from the US, Asia, Africa, Latin America, and the Caribbean. We're excited to have her with us today, speaking about history, horticulture, and immigrants, systems altering this land. So with that, I'm going to toss it to Wambui.
Hi, everybody. Thank you so much for coming. I see some friendly faces in the crowd. I want to say hi to Eric Calhoun from the Smithsonian Museum of African American History and Culture. Hi, Eric. I hope you're well. And I would just like to let everybody know that I'm home with a 7-year-old. I've prepped her. She has all her snacks, so hopefully she's not going to make an appearance. But if she does, please bear with me. So thank you so much for coming. This is a presentation that I've given before, and I find that people want me to give this presentation again because I think it covers so much of the web that is American landscape history. History meaning the people, the immigrants who have populated America, the plants they brought with them. Because this presentation builds a web that allows us to find ourselves in it and locate ourselves in the landscape and in the time and space of this country. So with that said, I hope you have all your snacks and I hope you have your water and that you're ready to go. So here we go. Some of you may have seen this before, but it's always great to see it again. So Libby, I hope I'm going to do this right. So for this one, I have titled it Horticulture, History, and Immigrants, Systems Altering This Land. So, and the systems are, of course, the people, the machinery, the economic momentum, that alters America and has altered and continues to alter America. So first, I always start by talking about myself. And how I locate myself in the landscape and what formed me as a human being. So this is me in the middle. This is Wambui Ippolito. Backdrop is the Rift Valley of East Africa, where I grew up as a child. We spent a lot of time in the Rift Valley because my family has a farm there, farms there. A lot of my family members have farms there, and my family has a farm there. And this is where we grew up. This is the vista that I saw constantly growing up, and that imprinted itself into my optic memory and allowed me to understand how the world is formed. So for me, the world was always this expansive place with limitless possibilities. And I truly believe, even now as I live in New York City, that the landscapes that you see as a child really encode themselves in you and in some way work themselves into that algorithm that you use to function in the world. How you move through the world, how you work with people, how you react to situations. This is very much part of the landscape in which you grow up. So for me, who grew up here, having a child now who grows up in New York City, because my daughter was born in New York City, I often wonder, who is she going to be as an adult, and how is she going to go through the world, having grown up in this metropolis? So this is the landscape that I grew up in. I'm very much formed by the migrations of my people through this landscape, the land that we work in this landscape, and the history of colonialism that tried to take this land away from us. Up until 1963 when we won our independence. And I'm also formed by the new vistas that I saw as the child of a diplomat, moving through, different countries and different landscapes. So my family is a history of migrations. I call myself East African and not Kenyan because I truly am East African. My maternal side traces its roots from Northern Sudan, Eritrea, Ethiopia, Somalia, and Kenya. So this is, very much who I am. And my paternal side traces itself from, what is now Kenya, out into Rwanda and the Democratic Republic of Congo. So I am very much an East African. But because I grew up in a matriarchal and matrilineal family and clan, I am known as the child of my mother, and my siblings are the children of my mother. We belong to our mother. We go back to our mother's hut. So this is who I am. This is African. And my clan motto, my family motto, has always been, to go is to see, and to last is to be wise. This is a very old saying. And in my tradition, in my language, we say, which means that as you live, as you move through the earth, as you move through the planet, as you move through landscapes, these landscapes make you wise, and you see many, many things. You see many things as you move through these landscapes. And at the end of your life, all those landscapes make you wise. They give you wisdom, and that wisdom becomes a part of this landscape because you then give that wisdom out to your children, who then give it out to their children. So it's this big web of wisdom that you come and take from the landscapes that you move through as you live your life. So a Hoki tourist picture here. This is a tourist picture everybody has probably seen when you think about East Africa and that Rift Valley that I talked about. But really, this is how it was for me growing up. This is how I felt, standing, looking out into this vast, very, very old depression, out of which we all spring, So every one of us has, we when we trace it all back, this is our home, So this is how I felt growing up. And on that Rift Valley, I grew up on a farm called the Motomayor Farm, which still very much exists, and my family is still very much there. And the Motomayor Farm is named after a sacred medicinal tree, the Olea africana tree. And here you see the drive into the farm. It's surrounded by the Olea africana tree. Now, what was very interesting for me, looking back, what is interesting for me looking back is that every single plant in this homestead was a medicinal plant or had some kind of use, So for us, the Olea africana tree is sacred and medicinal at the same time. So this is a tree where you go to talk to God, one of the trees where you go to talk to God. It is also a tree where my grandmother would go and, pick leaves or part of the bark to make medicine, So this was how the homestead was organized around the Olea africana tree. And these are my ancestors and family, many of whom grew up in that area or passed through that area or passed through that farm. These are all people who are buried there. Many of them are buried there. So my homestead is and that Olea africana is the place where we all congregate in life and death. So for me now, I can go see my living family, but I can also go visit my dead family because they are all there, around, surrounded by those trees, and their souls go back into that ground. And I say all this to give you a perspective of who I am and the story that I brought and the reality that I brought as an immigrant into America. Of course, as a very different kind of immigrant, because I was coming here as the child of a diplomat, but this is the story that we came here with. This was the reality. This was the baggage, if you want to call it that we brought here with. And for us, we didn't forget who we were when we came here. We didn't forget that landscape when we came here. This was very much part of our suitcases as we came into America. So I talked about colonialism in that initial picture that I showed you of myself in that landscape. Now, my family was very much a part of the anti-colonial movement in East Africa. My family were Mau freedom fighters. So these people in this picture are not my family. This is just a picture of Mau freedom fighters. But this is what my ancestors did. They made homemade guns. They took their their spears and their clubs and their swords, and they moved into the forest, into the mountains where God lives, where all our ancestors live, where our ancestors' bodies were left, and this is where they went to fight to get back their land. So this is very much a part of who I am. I grew up with many of these people, my great-grandparents, who were part of this movement, who suffered tremendously in these during this time, many of whom, were in British concentration camps, all in this fight for this landscape that we now retain as ours. And this is part of that landscape, part of the farm landscape where I grew up. I'm just showing this to you again to start to make you, as we move along this presentation, to start to make you think about the landscape that you locate yourself in, or that you located yourself in as a child, or what landscapes they are that form you as the person that you are here now. So again, this is the road to the farm, and on the farm, these were the primary plants that we grew on the farm. So the first one is the Colocasia esculenta on the left. In the middle, you have the Labla purpureus, and on the right, you have the Plectranthus barbatus. Now, all these are ornamentals here in the US, which was very shocking to me when I moved here. Colocasia is a staple, is an edible. We eat that for breakfast, we eat it for lunch, we eat it for dinner. There is no family gathering, no communal gathering at which Colocasia or esculenta is not present, cooked and ready to go. And here, of course, this is very much a tropical plant that is used in planters. I mean, in short, in 2 months, all of New York, New York City planters will have some form of Colocasia growing in them, And then in the middle, we have the Labla purpureus, which I believe is the hyacinth bean here, which is used as an ornamental. But this is women's food. This is medicinal women's food where I come from. And I have some here in the house too. This is the food that women eat when they're pregnant, when they give birth, after they give birth, when women's groups come together, for celebrations or for rites of passage. This is the food that women cook and eat. And on the right, Plectranthus barbatus, Mygoya, Acoleus forskiae before, which we used as our toilet paper. This is traditional toilet paper used at home, very medicinal. And every farm in my tribal homeland has Plectranthus barbatus growing in it. So like I said, I was the child of a diplomat, which meant moving around a lot. And finally, moving to the United States of America, to Washington, D.C., when I was 14 years old. So my mother worked at the Embassy of Kenya. I lived in Shepherd Park. And this is where my idea of how landscapes are organized in the West really began to form. Because wherever I had been in the West before, I was too young to even think about these things. So in America is when I started to understand the landscape and understand the people, especially in this country that is supposed to be a melting pot, What is this melting pot? What is the landscape of this melting pot? What is the history of this landscape, right? Because for me, in order to really locate myself in a place, I have to understand what came before, And it may be because of how I grew up, knowing the land, knowing who moved through that land, knowing what ancestors did what, in this location or that location. So for me, as part of being as part of that ancestral web, as part of that family of people who moved through landscapes, whose stories were very much alive in me, it was imperative that coming to the US, almost by default, I had to understand who I am now, in the spreading of that web of my ancestral story, right? So, I moved through life. I worked in DC. I worked down in the F Street, H Street hub. I worked for all those international organizations down there as a democracy consultant. But then somewhere right after I had my daughter, I decided that I wanted to go back to school, to learn American horticulture, because I knew that American horticulture is ornamental horticulture, something that we didn't have at home. There is no billion-dollar industry in Kenya that is solely about ornamental plants. So I wanted to educate myself, and so I applied to, was accepted to, and enrolled in the New York Botanical Garden School of Professional Horticulture, which I think is the best school of professional horticulture in America because of what it gives you as a person. So there, the first thing I see that shocks me completely to my core is Asagricium bald burlapped and transplanted. Now this picture was not taken in New York Botanical Garden, but this is exactly what I saw. A mature tree being bald, being burlapped and carried away by a crane. And this really, really shocked me because I had never seen anything like this. And I probably never will see anything like this where I come from, because a tree is considered, a tree is something that is so, in many ways, even with all the Christianity and the new religious traditions that have come in to Africa and to my part of the world, a tree is something that is sacred and considered. A tree is where we form familial bonds, we form communal bonds, where we fix communal problems, where we fall in love, where we educate each other. You know, this is the place of memory. This is the place where you create memory. This is a place, if you are so inclined, that you find and commune with the divine. So for me, that was very shocking to see that happen when I was in horticulture school. And so in horticulture school, I was taught ornamental horticulture straight up. This is what you do with perennials and annuals. You know, this is how we organize these landscapes. This is, you know, this is the best in design or the worst in design. But I never was taught anything about the people who lived on this land, right? What is the true history of this land? The true history of this land is not ornamentals being moved around. It is the people and the souls that have lived on this land and the stories that they have formed and the momentum that they have built on this land. And the oldest one of that was that of Native Americans that I didn't learn. So I started to do the research myself. I started to seek and find. And what was so amazing to me was realizing, you know, during my research, that so much of the world's food was Native American food, you know, like the tomatoes of Italy, like the potatoes of Ireland, you know, the beans and the maize of Africa, all staples, you know, in so many places around the world. So much of this was native to America and was taken, you know, spread around the world by the Spaniards, by the Portuguese, way back in the midst of time, you know. And this is what Native America gave to the world. So let's talk about now the time and space of the American landscapes, right? So this is the area of virgin forest in 1620 in the United States of America, when, you know, full-on colonialism begins in America. So as we see on the eastern part of the United States and the west and the Pacific Northwest and a little bit of the central part of the United States, it is covered with old growth forest. It is covered with shrubland, you know, all native, right? So this is how America looks when the first European arrives in America. Spaniard, Portuguese, you know, and then the European, you know, the European colonialists, that Mayflower group, right? Old growth forests. And what's key is that there are no surface earthworms at this time, at least in the northeastern part of the United States, absolutely no surface earthworms, because American forests at this time, for millennia, have just evolved to grow and have you know, balance without the need for these surface earthworms. And so here we see the Europeans coming in on their ships. They have their foodstuffs here, you know, many of which, you know, the seeds will end up in the ground, you know, and you know, and you know, we have to understand why they were coming here. You know, a lot of the time we have all learned, many of us have learned, that it was religious persecution, it was the search for land, you know, it was the search for, you know, it was adventure, you know, that brought people here. But really, one of the major factors that drove Europeans to come to America was the escape of deforestation in Europe. You know, Europe had been almost entirely deforested, by the time the Europeans decided to come to America. On the left, you see a picture of Roman soldiers felling trees for construction. This is at the time of Pliny the Elder. So at this time, Italy is almost entirely deforested, and people who go to Italy now know that there aren't that many, forests in Italy. Italy was the first place I ever moved to as a child. And I remember clearly, that there were no, I didn't see forests. So, on the right, you see the charcoal production. So at this time in Europe, around those 1600s, housing and building, ironwork, agriculture, overgrazing, cutting trees for fuel, shipbuilding, because now Europe is going all over the world in these big ships, the military, and urbanization has destroyed the forest cover of Europe for the most part, right? And when the Europeans come here, what do? They begin to cut trees down to send back to Europe for housing, for ironwork, for fuel, for shipbuilding, for the military and for urbanization. So they are replicating what they are running away from in Europe. They come here and they begin to cut down trees to send back to Europe. So this is a picture of, this is just a representation of what it is, what's going on. Here you see the ships in the back, somebody's cutting trees somewhere. Here, they get sent back to the ship and sent back to Europe. So it's very important to look at what the colonization of the American landscape truly means, right? And as people come here and settle down, they start to build homes, they start to, to bring in plants, they start to want to make this new land their new home. Hence, New England, New France, the New Netherlands, they see this as an extension of their homeland. This is not a landscape that has its own history, that has its own people, that has its own stories, that has its own soul, so to speak. This is just an extension of our world, our England, our France, our the Netherlands, And so the wars that are fought here are fought by those militaries, fighting for their land, for their territory. So I talked a little bit about earthworms and what these earthworms do. So those ships arrive with ballast, right? And the ballast is offloaded. And the ballast, of course, is just soil from Europe, which is filled with European earthworms, which then come here and get into the ground and begin to completely change the forest understory, of this new colony, right? Making it easier for these new plants that the people have brought. They've brought their yews, their roses, their fruits, rhubarb, whatever it is, these invasive plants that they have brought here, the earthworms make it easier for those plants to then come in and colonize the forest. So colonialism was not just people coming, it was these new animals, these new plants, these new insects, these new worms that come in with these ships and completely begin to, colonize this landscape and change it forever, right? And as the Europeans come, they bring another forced migrant with them. These were the forced migrants, these were the African migrants, and these were people who were sourced because of what they knew how to do, right? This is just a representation of many of the African immigrants who came here. This picture is actually of enslaved people in Brazil. But these are the people, these are the groups of Africans who came here. And as an African myself, I'm very capable of being able to tell where some of these people may have originated in Africa. And the one that really struck me was when I saw this man, because I knew where he was from based on the scar I thought I knew where he was from based on the scar that was going down his face. So, like I said, Africans were sourced because of what they knew how to do, They weren't just sitting around, beating drums and singing in Africa. These were people who had very long histories, agricultural histories, very long systems, very, very old systems of agriculture that worked, people who, many of whom may have had written languages. Here we see the script from Cameroon. They had food storage systems like this yam storage system in southeastern Nigeria and the Cameroons, which is still in place today. Homesteads that were very much, and still are very much organized, like my homestead at home, where medicinal and edible plants are grown, around the homestead and grown in communities, And so when I looked at this man and I looked at his scar, I immediately I remembered seeing this man's scar, this African man, I think it's a Batman man, and seeing that scar and knowing that, oh, he comes from these people who have this vast history, these people who had kingdoms and cities, states, and and an organized reality, that was clearly very different from Europe's reality, but no less important, right? So these are people who came here with know-how, and coming here, they brought with them their own plants, their own food, because they knew, just as every immigrant knows, and I say this all the time, when you are an immigrant and you are going somewhere that you have never been before and you are all by yourself, you want to know that there is going to be something that you can eat. You may not have shelter, but you want to be able to know that you will have food, right? So, and remember, these plants also, many of them were sourced by the Europeans when they were getting those, when they were enslaving Africans, because they needed food on the ships, to keep them going till they got to the Americas. So these are the plants that Africans bring with them now, right? And you cannot tell a Southern American that okra is not American food. You can't tell an American coffee is an American. You can't tell Americans that watermelon or so many different types of melons and watermelon isn't an American thing, and the many types of African, pigeon peas that were brought here are American, are very much American, and very much a part of, American social, culinary life, New Year's Eve, Christmas, Thanksgiving, and these all come from Africa, right, with these Africans. So I said that Africans were sourced because of what they knew how to do. And there's no better example of this than the rice fields of Southern Carolina. African women were sourced from the Senegambia region because they knew how to grow rice. And this is the only reason I think that the Senegambia region of West Africa was targeted the way it was. And the women specifically, entire villages depleted of women and girls, because these women knew how to grow rice, because they had been doing it in West Africa for 2,000 years. And they had been doing it better than Asians in Asia. Now, why is this the case? So I follow a very good horticulturalist and botanist called James Wong. James Wong is from Singapore. He is Chinese Singaporean and English. Born in Singapore, but I think he is British now. He lives in England, and I believe his mother is from England. And James Wong once said something that really made the connection for me in terms of this rice growing in South Carolina and why the women were specifically brought here to the United States. James Wong said, in passing, that he was the first person in his family, the first generation in his family, in his Asian family, to have a full set of teeth. And he said that it was because of the lack of nutrition in the rice that they ate. And immediately it clicked for me, because I knew that the Senegambian women had perfected the art of parboiling rice in Africa for 2,000 years. And that was retaining the nutrient from the husk into the grain of rice, and which made rice something that you could eat and get nutrition from, right? So this is why these women were brought here. So in the previous picture, I showed you the picture of the enslaved women in South Carolina, and these are their sisters and descendants of the sisters they left behind in Senegambia, still growing rice today in Senegambia. So we looked at that picture of the United States in the 1620s and all that forest cover. And so what happens in South Carolina, with all this movement, and of course there's so much going on those landscapes at that time, people coming in, cutting down trees, doing this and that, is that over a period of 200 years, the lower 48 states of the United States lose an estimated 53% of their original wetlands, completely gone, because of all this damming and irrigation and just alteration of the ecology, much of which is done by African women, enslaved African women, who are reorganizing and rearranging the landscapes of the South to make money to build the South. And while this is going, heavy logging is continuing all over the country. And these images really show you how the land and the landscapes of America as a living entity are altered in real time, and in very short time. When you look at the arc of history, in millennia, what needs to happen for a landscape to change. This is happening in a very short time. This is 200 or 300 years of complete obliteration on a landscape that is very ancient, right? So trees are getting cut down, and this picture made me want to cry, because this showed me exactly what happened to my landscape when even before I was born, when my mother was a child, when my grandparents were children, when the British came in and started to cut down these trees. We had trees like this in East Africa, many of which we would never cut down, because these were the trees that you go to speak with God. You couldn't even pick up fallen branches from these trees. And if anybody knows of Wangari Maathai, the Nobel Peace Prize winner from Kenya, who won the Peace Prize for all the work she did with the environment, Wangari, who happened to have been my mother's supervisor in college and who happened to save my life, which is a whole other story, when I was about 21, said how when she was growing up, her mother told her, when you go into the forest to collect wood, make sure you don't collect wood from this big tree. It was the mugumo tree, because this was the tree, we call it the mugumo tree, because this is the tree. Oh, you know what it is in English? The mugumo tree is it's a strangling, it's one of the strangling figs. It's native to East Africa. Her mother always told her, don't pick wood from this tree, because this is God's tree. And God, meaning how we know God to be as nature, as creation, as life, This is life's tree. This is life's tree, and we leave this tree alone. So when I looked at this picture, I saw life being destroyed, because I connected back to the trees where I come from that were completely cut down and then began to alter our landscapes completely. Because remember, these are the trees whose roots go all down into the rock and split up the rock, underground, and create these streams that come forth, and pour out onto the land and nourish the vegetation. So when these trees are cut down and those springs dry up, how quickly do you alter this landscape? So I see this happening here, and like I said, I saw this happening. I knew of this happening, before I was born, because of stories my mother and my grandmothers and my father and my grandfathers told me. So, Teddy Roosevelt comes along, 1908, he saves the day. There's that very beautiful book written about, I can't remember the name of it, but if you just Google Teddy Roosevelt book, Amazon, I can't remember the name of the book, but it's a wonderful book that talks about those 2 weeks where he's racing around in the White House with all these charts, carving out land to save, before he leaves office. So he saves the day, right? And so this is 1926. This is where we are, the area of virgin forest in America. And each dot on this represents 25,000 acres of land. So you can see what happens in that short time, which is, about 300 years. How this landscape is completely altered, in 300 years. And all this happens before this new wave of immigrants comes in, the second wave of immigrants. And this is the immigrant, that Ellis Island wave, that wave I call the Ellis Island wave. And mind you, the Ellis Island wave is taking place, but at the same time, there's that San Francisco, California wave coming from Asia, and I don't cover much of that in this presentation. I have another presentation for that. But so you have this new wave of immigrants that is coming in with the same aspirations as the other immigrants, whether they were forced migrants, enslaved people, or people coming here to escape deforestation from Europe. This new wave is coming, with the same hopes. We hope to build a home. We hope to have a home. We hope to have food. We hope to have shelter. We hope to have a chance. We hope to have something to leave for our children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. We hope to make a home in this America. So please always know that when we talk about immigrants, whoever they may be, and even those who are outside fences right now trying to get in, it's always the same hope. People are just coming here wanting to better their lives. So these are your ancestors here, Ruthenians, Norwegians, Bavarians, Dutch, Italian, and all these people come through Ellis Island. These are actual immigrants. These pictures are from the Ellis Island archives. You can access them, and this is how they arrive, and get off the ships, looking like this, because this is who they were. These are the people who then come and populate America, and over time become who you are, sitting behind those computers. And like I said, don't forget the Asian immigrants who come here, many of them forced and indentured, many of them living even more brutal lives than these immigrants. And they are creating the landscapes, out west in America, right? So more of these immigrants, you see, India, Algeria, countries that you didn't quite think you would think of as immigrants, but these are the people who are coming in at that time. There's a very wonderful website. If you are Italian and you are watching this, please go to the Italian Garden Project. It's online, and you can learn a lot about how Italian immigrants change the landscapes of urban areas, especially New York and the Philadelphia, Pittsburgh regions. Remember, these are people, many of whom were extremely poor, growing up in Sicily, Calabria, those two regions specifically brought so many immigrants to America, Sicily and Calabria, and all they knew was subsistence farming, which they then bring to this new landscape that they move in. And what these immigrants do, especially the Italians and the Greeks, is they have that know-how, that ornamental horticultural know-how, because they've been working on these estates in Tuscany. They've been working on these estates in Sicily. They've been working on these estates in mainland Italy, creating these beautiful gardens over centuries. And it was always a family thing. My father is a gardener. I'm a gardener. My son will be a gardener working for this estate. And so these children come here, these immigrants come here, and what do they know? They know how to create beautiful gardens. And what do we have in America? We have some new, very rich people in America who have made money off of that rice, who've made money off of, the logging, who've made money off of, whatever it is that has altered the landscape, right? So it's all one big web, and all this is connected, right? And where do these immigrants live? They have to live somewhere. So what does that mean? That you have to create, housing for them, right? So again, the landscape starts, we now start to see, urban America, we start to see all these buildings coming up, So the landscape, again, is still being changed because these people need to live somewhere. And with them, they bring their trash, right? So again, huge tracts of land have to be set aside just for the trash. Now, I live on Staten Island, where my husband who is Italian, Sicilian, was born and raised a second generation. And we had the biggest, at one point, it was the biggest landfill in America, and probably the biggest in the world. But there was one in Siberia that no one was ever allowed to see photographs of, which is claimed to have been bigger than this one. But this was 2,200 acres of garbage and toxic filth in a U.S. metropolitan area. here on Staten Island. Now, it doesn't look like that anymore, thank God. It's been rehabilitated. But so when we think of all this history that I have just given of what was going on in the land, we arrive at trauma. That's how I see it. Trauma for the land, trauma for the original people of this land, whose stories, like my story in East Africa, is completely tied to the landscape. We find our identity in that landscape. Without the landscape, we have no identity, right? So imagine what a Native American who, like me, gets their identity from the trees and the hill and the stone and the river, what happens to these people? Trauma happens to these people. And I found this picture a few months before I first gave this lecture for the NDAL conference. And this is George Gillett, who was the chairman of the Fort Berthold Indian Tribal Council. And here he was being forced to sign away the rights to his land. He was literally giving up that landscape to the United States of America to be flooded over for flood control. I think they were building a dam or something, but this was for flood control. And you see the man crying here, And this is what represents all that has happened for those 300 years up until this point. And now we move on to the new immigrant wave, which is people like me and the people who continue to come into America, and why we come here. So like I said, every immigrant comes here wanting to build a better life, right? I came here as a different kind of immigrant. I actually came and left when my mother's tour was over. But I came back later on in life, in my 20s, to work. But every immigrant who is coming here with a story of land, with a story of a landscape, and a need to be grounded. I think, some people want, who didn't grow up in landscapes such as mine, back home, may be content to live in a city or in suburbia. But the vast majority of those who come here because they want land. And the vast majority who are coming here are Mexican, Guatemalan, Honduras, that southern South American, Latin, Central American group of people. And these people come here and they bring their plants, just like those Europeans brought their plants, many of whom arrived first in the ships, with food, to grow and eat in this unknown place. And then that second wave who bring their cuttings, the cutting of the fig tree, the cutting of the olive tree, the cutting of the rose tree, the seeds from their mother's garden in Latvia or the Ukraine or Germany, These new immigrants bring their seeds too. They bring their plants too. And what does this mean for pollinators and other fauna? This is another change that is happening, unseen or maybe seen, but it is happening as well because these people are bringing their plants here as well. Now, these immigrants, unlike that initial first wave and a little bit of the second wave, aren't going out and cutting down trees and taking over 3,000 acres of land, or any kind of vast tracts of floodplains. They're concentrated in the cities, right? So the major urban cities is where you find all these immigrants coming in, and of course, many, at least on the eastern part of the United States, come in through airports. So the landscape change is different, right? And these immigrants who come here, many of them work for you and for me, in suburbia, cleaning our yards and tending to our plants, spraying our roses, spraying our grass, altering the landscape again in these little ways. So here's a picture of the Ace Basin of the South Carolina Ace Basin, which was once all rice cultivation. So what you see here, which is a picture taken with a drone and something that can be seen from space, was all once rice plantations. Now imagine this with God knows how many hundreds of thousands of women, primarily women, African women, growing rice. And then just like that, with the Emancipation Proclamation, these women walk off this land. They're free now. They're not forced to do any of this. And then that rice cultivation and that rice economy completely collapses because no one, is going to do this, after the Emancipation Proclamation. So this collapses. This is what happens. And over time, that landscape begins to repair itself, so that today, when you go down to South Carolina, when you go down to the Ace Basin, you see this. You see the aquatic animals have come back. You see the little animals have come back. You see the birds and the insects, you see the deer have come back, the turtles, things that had completely disappeared, that had completely been wiped off because they needed to be wiped off in order for this rice to be grown, are now coming back and are now, the landscape is beginning to stabilize itself. So I talked about the trash here on Staten Island. This is what that trash heap looks like today. Fresh Kills Landfill, which is now a New York Parks and Recreation ground where you can go and relax and, row a boat, So this is what it looks like today. Of course, it's still toxic underneath, but at least, with this native planting and cleanup, it looks much better than it did before. But again, like I said, the ground is still toxic, right? So whatever's going on in there, this is not somewhere I'm going to go have, a vegetable garden and eat. So, I give you this history to really think about how you move through American landscape and how you alter, this land, and to ask you to think about how you locate yourself in the landscape. How do I locate myself in the landscape? Is this my landscape? Do I really feel like this is where my stories are? Is this where my stories are? And if this is where my stories are they in contention with somebody else's stories? And whose have precedence? Whose story has precedence, right? So this is Staten Island Fireflies. They are now coming back. When my husband was growing up, I just put this in here just to tell you this little story. When I met my husband, we weren't living in Staten Island, but he always told me about how Staten Island was filled with fireflies when he was growing up, because so much of this island was marshland, And so there were millions of fireflies in the summertime on Staten Island, and they had all disappeared. But just because that Fresh Kills landscape where the trash once was cleaned up and rehabilitated, the fireflies are now starting to come back. So though they died when he was maybe in his, they had all disappeared when he was about 14, now that my daughter was born here, she can now start to see these fireflies again, right? And so last year, this is where we were with a forest cover in the United States of America. By the way, you can just Google these pictures on Wikipedia. This is where the forest cover is in 2020, looking much better than it was before. Not as good as it was in the 1600s before that initial wave of immigrants. And of course, that landscape that I just showed you, the 2020 landscape, is filled with all these immigrants who came here as well. The Acer platanoides, the Norway maple that has wreaked so much havoc up here in New York. I don't know if it's doing the same in DC, but this is such a troublesome tree up here. The Berberis thunbergii, the Japanese barberry, Hedera helix. When I moved here, for many years, I thought English ivy was an American plant until it clicked that English ivy is English, and it is an invasive, and it is all over America, and it has very much seeded itself into the landscape. Lithrum, kudzu down south. I lived in Atlanta. I couldn't get over kudzu, just take it. I mean, it's like a zombie that won't die, in Atlanta. And then, the Japanese honeysuckle that's everywhere. So these are also the immigrants who come to America and completely alter it. And now they're here to stay, because, they are here now, just like we are here, And again, the trauma of this land. I always put up pictures of Native Americans because I truly believe that the people who are native to a landscape carry the soul of that landscape. I carry the soul of my landscape in Africa. Many people carry the soul of Europeans. A Bavarian carries the soul of that landscape in Bavaria. Somebody in Kyrgyzstan carries the soul of that landscape. And these are the people who carry the soul of this landscape. So where to America? What happens moving forward, right? So I've been following Deb Haaland for years, years before I said, oh, look, here's this Native American lady, and she, she's in politics, and I'm going to follow her on Twitter. And over the years, I just would, read what she would write, I would empathize with her, because her story and the story of her people was very similar to my people's story in East Africa, and that fight, for our land, and here she is today as the Secretary of the Interior. And when this happened, I just felt like America had crossed the Rubicon, so to speak, and last week or 2 weeks ago on Twitter, she put this post up, and it really touched me, and she was talking about meeting with tribes, and stakeholders to talk about sacred landscapes, sacred landscape, a term that, when is the last time you heard that, regarding American ground, a sacred landscape, and that is what land is. It is living, it has a rhythm, it has a story, it has a memory, there are things that have happened on these landscapes way before we ever showed up, and yes, populations move, populations change, there are shifts in time and space, but I always think about it like this, and I try to keep it very simple. If a group of my people, let's say my group from my village in the Rift Valley, my village is called Yamombi. Yamombi means of the mother, and the mother, Yamombi being the mother of my people, the woman, the female idea and entity out of which we all spring. If the people of Yamombi decided to move to China today, and say, okay, we are here now, and this is where we're going to live, and this is our landscape, does that make sense? I don't know, but this is something that we have to really marinate upon, if such a term, encompasses what I'm trying to say. We have to marinate in this and think about who we are, in this American landscape. Think about how we navigate through this world, what momentum we are trying to build, when we think about the ecology of this land. And with that, I just want to say thank you so much. Thank you for listening to me. I hope you enjoyed this, and I am glad to be here with you.
We have a minute or two left in the time here. If you would speak a little bit about the idea of naming and plant names, and how, because a lot of the plant names that we use are from like that Linnaean sort of system, sort of westernized names, and if there's been any sort of conversation about the sort of use of names that Native tribes have used versus sort of these westernized names, or names.
Yeah, the conqueror always wins, the spoils. So I mean, it is what it is, but thankfully, there are many of us who are here now, educated in the so-called Western sense, but who are very much educated in our traditional senses, right? And in our traditional knowledge, so that for me, when I came here and people said, oh, that's colocasia, I said, oh yeah, that's just Ndoma, and Ndoma is what we call colocasia, and that is what it is, you know what I mean? And has been since my people were on this planet, you know what I mean? and that my people have very old DNA because they are the people of East Africa. So Ndoma is the real word, and Taro in Hawaii, Thank you, Kristen Jones, So what I'm seeing now, I have friends who work in the East African herbarium, which is a wonderful herbarium. I mean, the East African herbarium is the oldest herbarium in Africa, and it's just so wonderful to see these new words being used, Africanized words, for these new plants that are being described, in Africa now. So, I mean, we still have a ways to go, but things are changing, and what I'm finding is that so-called indigenous people, and I consider myself indigenous to East Africa, what has been happening over the last 50, 60 years is that people are just saying, hey, you know what? I matter, and I'm no less than my knowledge is not in any way, shape, or form less important than your knowledge or this knowledge that you are teaching me, right? So, yeah.
Yeah. Thank you for that. Someone else said that they wonder if those of us who feel very grounded actually have a genetic memory of working the land from their ancestors.
Yes, but I think this is the thing now. I think that what happened with these waves of European migration and this idea of, and even to a certain extent, the enslaved African, but what happened to enslaved Africans is that they were othered immediately, and they were always made to feel like they weren't part of this thing called America, even today, What happened to many Europeans, or the majority of European Americans, is this idea of becoming American meant that you forget where you came from. You know what I mean? So I'm coming here and I'm going to become an American, whether you were British, and then later, first the Irish were othered, and then their whole drive was to become American. Then the Italian comes and he's othered, and then he strives to become American. And a lot of that becoming American means taking on certain ideologies, which for the most, so many of which are not the right ideology in terms of how you interact with other human beings who may not look like you, but also then who you become, who you were, and the landscape that you came from becomes, a festival, it becomes, St. Patrick's Day, we're all Irish, or the feast of, Saint, whatever, if you're Italian, but that actual, remembrance and groundedness of I am Sicilian, or I am German, or I am, Slavic, or, whatever it is, I'm a Sami Laplander. And that is the landscape that is in my DNA, completely disappears, to become this thing called an American. You know what I'm saying? And I always say, if you go back to that, if you start to go walking in those landscapes, even mentally, even through Google, you start to orient yourself differently. Because let me tell you something, at the end of the day, the person who really carries the soul of this land is the Native American, and it is what it is. That's how I see it. You know what I'm saying? And I was talking to, I was on a Zoom the other day, or an Instagram Live with a Veranda magazine, and I made a comment. I said, think about it this way. Think about your ancestor in Mongolia. Let's say you're Mongolian and you're here now on this call. And for thousands of generations, your ancestors have ridden horses in that beautiful Mongolian landscape. That's all they've known. It is in them, this galloping horse, and that vast expanse is in them. And it has encoded itself into that algorithm that makes you who you are. And then you get on a flight and you fly to LaGuardia, and here you are, I'm a New Yorker, What happens to that landscape? What happens to that history? What happens to that horse galloping in you? does it just die? Does that memory, that genetic memory, that emotional memory just die? What happens to that? You know what I mean? And is that completely erased, and then you become this like almost like a sheet of paper that is dropped into New York? No, it doesn't. So if people begin to look back into those landscapes, you start to find all kinds of things. Maybe these quirks that you have, how you react to this or how you react to that, and you think, oh, I'm just quirky, or my kid just behaves in this quirky way, No, that could be something that is in you based on that landscape that for thousands of generations your ancestors have been living in, and that finds itself into who you are. There's a very beautiful documentary, which is kind of hard to find, but if you can find it, please do. It's called The Language You Cry In. I'm going to Google this here. The Language You Cry In. And basically what happened in this documentary is that there was an African man who was, this is probably in the 80s, he was Senegambian, and he was a PhD student, I believe. And he was down in South Carolina doing something. And he heard a woman, an African-American woman, humming a tune or singing a song. And he said, oh my God, she's singing in a Senegambian language. So he asked her to sing the song again, and he realized she was singing this in this language that he knew from Senegambia. Turns out that her grandmother, she learned the song from her grandmother, who had been the daughter of a Senegambian slave, right? Enslaved woman, sorry, I don't like to use the word slave, and a Senegambian enslaved woman. And this song had passed down in their family. This is a Gullah family in South Carolina. And so, big story, a book is written, a documentary is made, and this lady who sang the song is taken back to Senegambia, back to that village where the women sing that song with her, So this is the idea, the language you cry in, and that language you cry in is that genetic memory I'm talking about. Now, this all came to a head to me when my daughter was very little. And in as much as I speak English and I'm here speaking English, whenever my daughter would topple over when she was a kid, I would always scream out in my language, in my mother's language, in my maternal language. I never screamed out, oh no, my daughter fell down. I would always scream in my mother's language. I would say oh, my child, mwana wakwa, which means my child, but it was always in my maternal language, which is still in me, which is in there, and pops out at those moments when I'm the most human, Sue said, my Mongolian colleague said they don't ride horses anymore. Yes, I get it. I'm just talking, I'm just saying, imagine. We're just imagining. My people don't hunt lions, but I'm just.
Yeah. We did have a good question. Someone asked, what is one action that the average city dweller with no wealth or power can do to preserve the land?
Buy seeds. A packet of seed costs $1, and just donate it to your the Ecological Landscape Alliance. I mean, in those little ways.
Someone also asked about your design aesthetic. So
yes,
when you design, what is your approach in light of this talk? Are you a purist when it comes to natives, only using plants found, say, before 1600? Or do you look worldwide, just avoiding known invasive or somewhat in between? A true purist might try to replicate the sort of landscape that was originally here. So where do you stand on that?
So, I've been having this conversation with a friend of mine, Cleve West, who is an Indo-British designer in the UK, because we find ourselves in that same mental space of, why am I even designing? Why am I even reorganizing this landscape? Okay, just to answer your question, Eva, quickly, the client always rules, at the end of the day. It's always what the client wants. You try and steer the client in a certain direction, but at the end of the day, if they like dahlias, they like dahlias, right? If I'm ever given, 50 acres of native land in New York to design, I know I won't design it. I'll just edit what I find there. So my whole thing, Eva, if given space to do this, is I work with nature. I work with what nature already has, and I just work with nature. So I approach with the editing mindset now, not the reorganizing mindset. And I talked about this in, if anybody here, I know Eric was in the NDAL symposium, and I talked about this idea that we have to reorganize nature in itself is messed up. You know what I mean? You know, and I talked about how what colonialism meant to so many people in different countries now, you know, where, for instance, for us with the British, they came into East Africa and they immediately set about creating, you know, a little, you know, English city in East Africa, which meant the avenues with the trees and the flower beds and the this and that, and, you know, horticulture department and, you know, horticulturalists are trained, and now we are going to make this beautiful city. And then after independence, what happens, not just in Kenya kind of kept it up, but, you know, in other, you know, newly independent African and Asian countries, is that, you know, though a lot of those parks are left to revert back to nature, you know, and then the trope, you know, comes up that is, well, see, these Africans can't even take care of their parks. These Africans can't even do this, but it was never in us to organize nature. You know what I'm saying? So if for a brief 100 years, some people came from somewhere else and organized nature and told us this is how it's supposed to be, are we then supposed to say, oh, now because they kept, you know, this park, this thing they call a park, are we supposed to now continue this? Or do we just let it go back to the nature that it was before? Do you see what I'm saying? You know?
So I just want to say a very big thank you to you for joining us today and sharing this amazing presentation with us.
Thank you.
It's been lovely spending this hour with you today, and thanks to everybody else who has joined us on this wonderful Saturday.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, everybody.